April 1945, Northern Germany. The war is collapsing, but not quietly. Burned-out vehicles line the country roads like bones from a giant long dead. The air smells of damp earth and engine smoke. British soldiers move carefully, rifles raised, expecting ambush even when the enemy is already broken. A group of German prisoners stands under guard, wounded, exhausted, uniforms filthy with mud and ash. But one figure draws the British officer's eyes. A young nurse, barely holding herself upright, clutching a blood-stained medical satchel as though it still has purpose. Her Red Cross armband should have been a shield. Instead, a word, crude, black, and violent, is smeared across her coat. VERRÄTERIN traitor. Not painted by enemies. Painted by Germans, the officer hesitates. He's seen SS cruelty toward their prisoners, but not toward their own medics. Her face is ashen, her mouth set tight, not in fear of the British, but in the shame and terror inflicted by those she served. For a moment, the battlefield noise fades. One question hangs unspoken. What must a healer do to be condemned to? By mid-1944, Germany's once unstoppable advance had reversed into a desperate retreat. From Normandy to the Vistula, Allied forces closed in. Cities burned. Rail lines snapped. Medical stations were swallowed by the speed of collapse. What remained of order now depended on fear. The Feldgendarmerie, the military police known as chain dogs, carried new authority. Shoot retreating soldiers, arrest anyone helping them, and enforce discipline with terror. The SS demanded absolute loyalty and watched nurses with suspicion, believing that women in medical roles were prone to softness, a dangerous weakness in a moment when the Reich commanded only sacrifice. In the final months, Hitler's orders grew harsher. Any soldier abandoning his unit was a traitor. Anyone who helped him was worse, a corrupter of morale. As thousands of wounded stumbled westward, many ended up at aid stations without paperwork, without commanding officers, without hope, and nurses were forced to make impossible decisions. If they treated these men, they risked being accused of supporting desertion. If they refused, the men died in front of them, slowly, painfully, calling for help that medical ethics demanded they provide. This tension exploded in late 1944 and early 1945 when the German Western Front shattered into improvised defensive lines. Even civilians became pawns. Elderly men and teenage boys conscripted into the Volkssturm, often arriving wounded within hours of being issued a rifle. Many medics began secretly treating them without authorization, an act of humanity punishable by military law. Meanwhile, the race westward fueled a new terror, the fear of Soviet capture. Rumors spread that surrendering to the Red Army meant torture or execution. And too often, those rumors were true. Entire hospitals fled toward British and American lines, seeking the slim protection of Geneva. But the SS saw running as treason. Medical convoys were stopped and searched. Anyone suspected of rescuing cowards or aiding civilians marked for evacuation could be sentenced on the spot. That is how the word VERRÄTERIN, traitor, found its way onto the uniforms of some nurses. No trial, no defense, just paint, humiliation, and a bullet promised later. For some, the paint came first. Death came after. The young nurse standing before the British officer had tried to save two wounded boys, boys considered worthless to the regime. That was enough. As Germany collapsed inward, turning its fury on its own, she became a symbol of a system that punished compassion. And now, under British guard, her fate would no longer be decided by the Reich, but by those she had been taught to call enemies. Her story now moved beyond survival and into the judgment of a different army. World War II transformed medicine into a weapon of survival. Germany, preparing for a war of speed and total mobilization, built one of the largest military medical infrastructures in Europe. By 1945, over 500,000 women served the Wehrmacht in medical and auxiliary roles: stretcher bearers, nurses, radiographers, clerks, and frontline triage responders. They wore the uniform, but not the power. Their orders came from a machine that valued human life only when it contributed to victory. The WWII, as they were officially called, trained under strict military discipline. They learned how to stop arterial bleeding, administer morphine carefully rationed by command, and prioritize the wounded by whether they could return to the fight. They treated shattered limbs, tended to infected burns, and tried to calm dying boys calling for mothers who would never hear them again. Under the Geneva Conventions, medical personnel were supposed to be neutral, protected by the Red Cross stitched onto their sleeves. But the world on paper did not resemble the world in battle. On the Eastern Front, mercy itself became dangerous. German medical units were often targeted by Soviet troops seeking revenge for atrocities committed by German forces. Many female medics were assaulted or executed upon capture. Their uniforms marked them not as healers, but as accomplices. Survival required more than skill. It required silence, obedience, and luck. The Western Front offered slightly more predictability, better adherence to international law, clearer prisoner policies, yet suspicion lingered. British and American soldiers respected the medical symbol, but viewed it with caution. A nurse tending to wounded men could still be saving fighters who would return to kill again. Inside the German system, trust was even more fragile. Doctors loyal to ideology pressured nurses to prioritize SS and high-ranking officers. Military police monitored conversations for signs of defeatism. Compassion became something that had to be justified, documented, approved. A wounded soldier found without proper authorization might be labeled a coward, a deserter fleeing the front. Assisting such a man could lead a nurse to accusations of weakening the fatherland. Hospitals themselves changed shape as the war dragged on. Grand medical centers became bomb shelters. Field stations turned into makeshift morgues. Trucks packed with wounded churned toward the collapsing heart of the Reich. And women like the young nurse captured in April 1945 were left on the thin line between medical duty and political crime. Their purpose was to save lives. Their reality demanded they choose whose life was allowed a chance. It was a world where healing could be interpreted as betrayal, and loyalty was measured not by compassion, but by how faithfully one obeyed the dying ideology of a collapsing regime. A collapse that would soon reshape every rule they lived by. Her battlefield was not defined by territorial lines, but by the inches between life and death. German field nurses learned early that they must work fast, not to save a life, but to return a soldier to the front. Their training manuals emphasized efficiency. Their superiors emphasized results. Yet their hearts emphasized something else entirely. To her, every wounded soldier was simply a human being trying not to die. A young farmhand from Bavaria, a baker's apprentice from the Ruhr. A frightened schoolboy pulled into uniform too soon. She saw them after the propaganda had been stripped away. Just boys, bleeding. But the Reich saw a different picture. A soldier unable to return to battle was no longer a soldier. He was wasted resources. As the lines collapsed in early 1945, those wounded retreating from combat arrived in overwhelming numbers. Limping, frostbitten, shell-shocked. Some had thrown away weapons. Others had lost the will to fight. For the regime, these men were not casualties. They were cowards, deserving punishment, not treatment. She disobeyed anyway. She hid two boys in a dark corner of an overcrowded aid station. She cleaned their wounds, gave them water, tried to keep them awake. She chose compassion over ideology, a choice that transformed her from a healer into a criminal. Her betrayal was not against Germany. It was against fear, And fear, in the dying days of the Reich, ruled more fiercely than loyalty. Captain Richard H. had seen enough war to understand its cruelty. He had landed on the beaches of Normandy, fought through hedgerows soaked in blood, watched soldiers under his command die because another army was determined to prolong the inevitable. He knew what war did to men, and what it did to the conscience. By April 1945, he and his unit had one mission: end the suffering as fast as possible. The Geneva Conventions shaped his duty. Medical personnel were to be respected, prisoners treated with fairness. Even in combat, the British Army upheld that law, not because the enemy deserved it, but because morality must survive war if peace was ever to return. So when he saw the word VERRÄTERIN scrawled across the nurse's uniform, something inside him tightened. This symbol, meant to shame her, told him more about the German collapse than any intelligence briefing could. She had expected him to treat her as the enemy. Instead, he saw a medic punished for doing exactly what she had sworn to do. In a moment where he might have looked away, he stepped closer. War had already taken enough from the world. Letting cruelty continue, even under the guise of another army's law, was not something he could allow. His decision to intervene would soon place him at odds with men who believed that humanity should stop at the edge of a uniform. By 1945, the German command structure had mutated into something brutal and paranoid. Loyalty was measured not by bravery, but by obedience under collapse. Every retreat was labeled cowardice, every hesitation treason. The Feldgendarmerie and SS enforced this ideology with absolute authority. Their orders were clear: better to kill a deserter than allow a single step backward. Hospitals and medical convoys became checkpoints of suspicion. Field medics were interrogated about every patient. Documentation mattered more than heartbeat. The nurse's decision to treat two unauthorized soldiers, one barely old enough to shave, was seen not as mercy, but as sabotage. Her superiors did not see a girl desperate to save a life. They saw a weak link who dared to override the system. Punishment was public for a reason. A word painted on a coat was a message. Defiance is contagious. Crush it early. The SS man who marked her likely felt nothing. No hesitation. No remorse. He was doing what the regime demanded, preserving morale through terror. But morale was long dead. Only fear remained, wielded against those who tried to remain human in a machine intent on destroying anything human within it. And that fear followed her into British custody, where she expected no better fate. War distorts right and wrong until they become unrecognizable. Even the most sacred roles, like medicine, are reshaped by necessity and ideology. A soldier's life carries value only if it contributes to the war's objectives. A medic must save the life the army wants, not the one gasping at her feet. So what is the right choice? A nurse who follows orders and lets a man die remains loyal. A nurse who saves him risks a firing squad. British officers like Captain Richard H. believed their war was just, that humanity must endure even amid destruction. But they too faced moral dilemmas. Treating an enemy soldier could allow him to return to fighting. Rescuing a German medic might enable the enemy's survival. Yet war is more than armies fighting. It is human beings choosing what kind of world will survive the guns. The German nurse chose compassion and paid for it in humiliation. The British officer now faced his own test. Would he uphold the principles he claimed to fight for, even when applied to an enemy marked as a traitor by her own? These competing moralities were about to collide in one decisive moment, a moment that would change the nurse's fate and the officer's conscience forever. Liberation and capture. Spring 1945, the war was ending, but not softly. In the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing like a building eaten from within. Roads that once echoed with the march of disciplined troops now carried refugees, deserters, and the wounded, all fleeing the same invisible front. The nurse, her uniform torn, red cross faded to gray, moved through this chaos like a ghost. Her field hospital had disbanded days ago. Her commanding officer had vanished into the forests. She carried a medical satchel, the only thing she refused to abandon, though she had little left inside but gauze and trembling hands. When British armored cars rolled through the village of Lüneburg, the townspeople barely lifted their eyes. Occupation had become a mercy compared to annihilation. The nurse stepped out with her hands raised. No weapon, only a bandaged soldier slumped at her side. The Tommies shouted in English she didn't understand, but her instinct was the same she'd followed for years. Protect the wounded first. She knelt beside the soldier, whispering his name, but it was too late. He exhaled once and stilled. The British sergeant aimed his rifle, uncertain whether to lower it. Then the British officer, Captain Richard H., approached. He noticed something odd about the nurse. Not the fear in her eyes, but the words scrawled across her uniform coat in thick, uneven paint. VERRÄTERIN. Traitor. He frowned, glancing between his men and the body on the ground. Who did that to her? He asked quietly, but no one answered. Her voice broke through the wind, trembling. I tried to save them. They said it was forbidden. The officer understood enough German to catch the meaning. Forbidden. Saving the enemy. The irony struck him hard. He motioned to lower the rifles. She's not a threat, he muttered. She's a nurse, but his men hesitated. One whispered, Sir, the word, traitor. Maybe she's dangerous. Captain H. stepped closer, eyes meeting hers. Exhaustion, meeting exhaustion. Get her water, he ordered. And take that coat off her. She's not our enemy anymore. In that moment, the nurse flinched, not at the guns, not at the shouting, but at kindness itself. After months of cruelty, compassion felt foreign, almost unbearable. As dusk fell over the ruined town, British medics carried away the dead while she sat in silence, clutching her satchel. Around her, the war ended in scattered bursts of gunfire and the distant rumble of tanks crossing bridges. But for her, and for the officer who had spared her, the real battle was just beginning. Between duty and mercy, justice and forgiveness. The interrogation and the truth behind Traitor Night settled heavy over the temporary British command post. A commandeered schoolhouse still lit by a single, flickering lantern. The nurse sat on a wooden bench, her satchel clutched to her chest like armor. The removal of her marked coat left her cold, exposed. Without the word VERRÄTERIN across her chest, she looked like any other medic. But the truth remained burned into her skin more deeply than the paint ever could. Captain Richard H. entered quietly, a file under his arm. He wasn't a hardened interrogator. He'd spent most of the war protecting the wounded, not condemning them. But orders were orders. Every German taken into custody had to be questioned. He sat across from her. Name? He asked in slow, careful German. Eva. Her voice was barely a whisper. Nurse, 3rd Army Corps. And the marking? He gestured to the coat folded on the table. The word like a wound. Eva's eyes filled with something between shame and defiance. I treated men who refused to fight, she said. Boys who ran. Farmers who wanted to go home. They were shot as examples. I tried to save them. I failed. She tightened her grip on the satchel. My commander told me I had betrayed Germany. They beat me. Then they marked me, so no one would trust me on either side. The captain exhaled slowly, punished for saving lives, condemned by those she served. War twisted the definitions of loyalty until doing good became a crime. He opened the satchel, expecting bandages and morphine, evidence of her medical role. Instead, he found letters, dozens of them, some sealed in blood-stained envelopes, some never posted, all addressed to mothers, wives, sisters. Eva's face broke into panic. "I promised them that someone would tell the families what happened." A tremor ran through her. "I wrote every name, every final message. I thought maybe the truth could be kinder than silence." The captain stared at the letters, realizing the weight she had carried. The ledger of the forgotten. These were not the acts of a traitor, but a woman trying to rescue dignity from death. "You risked your life for this?" he asked. Eva shook her head, tearful but firm. "No, for theirs," the lantern hummed. Outside, drunken victory shouts echoed faintly. The world celebrating peace that still hadn't found everyone. Captain H stood, closing the satchel gently. "We will protect you," he said. Eva stared at him, not believing, not daring to. "No one protects traitors," she replied, the words trembling like a prayer. The captain met her gaze. "Then we'll call you something else." For the first time in months, her shoulders loosened, a single breath of relief in a war that had stolen thousands. But as the captain walked away to file his report, he wondered whether his compassion had just broken protocol, and whether saving her might cost him too. Captivity, protection, and bureaucracy. In the final weeks of the war, the British established temporary holding camps across northern Germany. Makeshift facilities housed in schools, warehouses, or open farmland. Eva, still recovering from her injuries, was transported with other POWs to one such camp near Lüneburg. The barbed wire fences were less a symbol of punishment and more a necessary barrier against chaos. German deserters, vengeful civilians, and scattered SS units still posed threats from beyond the perimeter. For the first time in months, Eva slept without the fear of being executed in her sleep. Yet captivity carried a strange weight. Nurses were supposed to heal, to care. Here, she had no patience, no bandages, no role. Freedom from danger did not feel like freedom at all. Within days, the International Committee of the Red Cross arrived to register German captives, especially women, whose presence as POWs raised complicated political questions. Under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel were to be treated as non-combatants and released once the situation stabilized. But paperwork moved slower than trauma. The Red Cross inspector paused when he reviewed Eva's documents. He saw the notation, "Suspected traitor," stamped in thick, accusing ink. The British captain stood nearby, jaw set, refusing to let that single word dictate her future. "She is medical personnel," he insisted. "She cared for our wounded as well as theirs." The inspector nodded and added a note in his ledger. "Protected. Requires medical rest and psychological care." It wasn't vindication, but it was a start. Meanwhile, rumors spread among the German prisoners. Some spat at her feet. Others avoided looking in her direction. No one wanted proximity to a woman branded dishonorable. The ones she had tried to save were dead. The ones who survived preferred not to remember her courage. Even among captivity, war's cruelty followed her. Still, there were small mercies. British nurses, curious and sympathetic, brought her tea and clean linens. A chaplain left a Bible by her bedside. Not to convert, but to comfort. And every evening, Captain H would ask if she needed anything. She never knew what to say. As Allied officials debated the repatriation of medical personnel, Eva waited, her fate suspended between two nations that no longer wanted to claim her. Yet the satchel of letters remained with her, tucked safely beneath her blanket. It was all she had left of who she once was, and who she hoped she might still be. Return to ruins and a memory that follows in late 1945. When most German medical personnel were cleared for release, Eva's name finally appeared on the repatriation list. Her papers no longer bore the accusation of VERRÄTERIN. The British officer, Captain H, had ensured that. He handed her the folded documents personally. "You deserve to go home," he told her. She wanted to believe him, but home had ceased to exist. The village she returned to was quiet, a silence built from absence. Her parents had been killed in an air raid a year earlier. The hospital where she once trained was a burned-out shell. Relatives welcomed her, yet whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Her uniform made them uneasy. Her survival made them suspicious. Why did the Allies let you go? What did you tell them? The old branding had simply changed audience. Eva found occasional work with local doctors struggling to rebuild the healthcare system. She stitched wounds, delivered babies, and treated influenza outbreaks, all while pretending not to hear the questions buried beneath polite gratitude. There was no medal for mercy in a defeated nation. Meanwhile, Captain H resumed his military duties. Yet the memory of that night, the broken woman clutching a satchel of letters, returned often in quiet hours. He submitted a final report describing her assistance to British wounded soldiers, hoping it might protect her from post-war accusations. War taught soldiers to forget, but some burdens insisted on being remembered. Years later, while stationed in London, he received a small envelope bearing unfamiliar German handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. A rebuilt clinic, children smiling at a woman in a white coat, and a short message. "I am working again. Thank you for allowing me to remain a nurse." Eva. He placed the photograph in his desk drawer beside letters from his own wartime comrades. It belonged there, among the quiet reminders that not all battles were fought with weapons. Eva never married. She dedicated her life to healing in communities that slowly learned to trust her hands. The satchel of war letters remained hidden in a cupboard, a document of loss she could never read again. Her story, like so many across a devastated Europe, faded into the background, unnamed, uncelebrated, but its meaning endured, carried by the lives she continued to save. And that moral weight, the human conflict behind uniforms and accusations, becomes the final question history must confront. Because the end of war did not bring the end of judgment. It only changed who did the judging. The quiet courage of mercy. War is often described in terms of victories and defeats. Armies advancing, cities falling, borders shifting. But beneath the headlines lies another battlefield entirely. The human heart. Eva's story exists in that hidden space, where conscience clashes with command, and where the courage to save a life can be punished more severely than the will to take one. Throughout history, medical neutrality has stood as one of the few principles capable of softening war's brutality. The Geneva Conventions were created because, even in conflict, humanity must not be abandoned. Yet principles on paper cannot always protect those who live by them. Eva learned this in the hardest way. Mercy can look like treason to those who fear compassion more than defeat. And still, she chose to heal. The British officer's decision to defend her was no grand act of heroism. It was a simple recognition that uniforms do not define morality. A wounded man is a wounded man, whether his flag is rising or burning. Their lives crossed for only a moment. But that moment changed two futures. In the decades after World War II, hospitals reopened, nations rebuilt, and new laws strengthened the rights of medical workers in conflict zones. Progress was made, because people like Eva proved that humanity can survive even its darkest hours. History often forgets the healers, but every life they save is a monument time cannot erase.